All right, well, I want to welcome everyone to What Time Is It? Shifting our energy use to low carbon times. This is a really exciting session for us because ultimately we like to talk a lot about energy efficiency here. We've been doing it for over 20 years at Green Home Institute. Every day, that's all we talk about. But what's becoming increasingly clear is not just how much energy we use, but almost more importantly, in some regards, when we're using energy, because that will impact whether it can be powered by renewables. And so that's why I'm very excited. We've had these conversations once in a while here and there, but I'm really excited to dive into it really for the first time here in a decade on our webinar series with some of our speakers today. And so if you're here for the first time, just a reminder, this session is brought to you by the Green Home Institute. The Green Home Institute is a nonprofit with a mission to empower people to make healthier and more sustainable choices in the renovation and construction of the places we live. My name is Brett Little. I'm the program manager, and I will be your moderator today. As with all of our sessions, this course is approved for multiple continuing education units, as well as our certified green home professional for both place and energy pillar, and AIA Health, Welfare, and Safety, which may make it applicable to your state-based design or contractor license. I want to give a shout out. We always like to do a member shout out to our member, Steve Hampshire, who's been featured in the ASHRAE Journal, and you can go check that out, about whether ground source heat pumps, aka geothermal for heating and cooling, are our future. Check that out. He's a member. Our members are doing amazing things, so sign up to become a member. You can too. We'll feature you. We've got a couple of these corn-based mugs left, right, grown and made right in the USA. We'll send it your way thanks to our board member sponsor, True Tech Tools. And you get instant access to all of our webinars just by becoming a member and signing up. Before we get started, we want to say a huge thanks to our top tier sponsor, Rheem. They just received an Energy Star Award 2022 for their ProTerra heat pump water heater. We're talking 400% energy efficiency, more efficiency than any other water heater out there. The way these heat pump water heaters work is that they take energy out of the air, they pull it in through a fan, they exhaust colder air, it runs it through a refrigerant loop, and it uses it to heat the energy with electricity at super efficiencies. They're just super efficient over standard electric or gas. They're quieter, they have good warranties, leak detection, and they work with automation systems. Right off of your phone, you can get this information and control the system, and it works great. The system can be ducted if you're concerned about cooling down a space you use, or it's a small closet, and they can be strung together to serve large multifamily developments. In regards to this session today, these systems actually work like a battery. Imagine your water heater being a 2-for-1 like a battery. This is how I use my system. Basically, what I do is I have the system turn down 20 degrees from 2 to 7 o'clock, which is my peak time use. And then that way, for the most part, it won't use water. It will use water if I need it during that time. It'll heat it up, but otherwise it usually doesn't heat water then. And then it heats right back up after. And sometimes local utilities have systems in place to actually control this and pay you and your clients to do this. And I don't know if you all saw the breaking news yet that came out, but one of the biggest problems with these systems, especially as we try to get them to assist people in need who don't get access to these types of systems, is they cost a lot of money to re-hardwire a home for a 240 volt service. So now they have the 120 plug and play heat pump water heater. A lot of manufacturers are coming out. Rheem was the first to the gate to do it. So check that out. Check out everything they have to offer over at rheem.com. And thanks to our second tier sponsor, Aware. This system that they have is a device that tracks 5 indoor air quality metrics in real time down to 5-minute intervals. That includes temperature, humidity, carbon dioxide, volatile organic compounds, and PM 2.5. We're challenging all of our builders and architects to leave these behind in your projects so you can actually prove you have a healthy home, not just saying it. So check them out over at Aware. All right, well, I am, again, super excited about this session. What time is it? Shifting energy use in low carbon times. And real quick before we get started, this session is a part of our sort of new Green Home Institute Environmental Justice Series. This is where we envision green homes for all. what we want to do is we recognize barriers to low income and BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, having trouble accessing greener homes. And by doing that, having access to greener homes, we know it can protect against areas where folks like this tend to live, have higher pollution and lower air quality, which is very frustrating. We also like to recognize the opportunity to engage more BIPOC community members in residential green building roles, jobs, and all of that. So we just want to state that and talk about it, and you'll be hearing more from that in some of our sessions. Also, this session is a part of our ongoing Resident Race to Zero in Ann Arbor, which anyone you know can sign up, and they can win $500 just by reducing their energy. And what's relevant to this session today is that if they sign up through the DTE time of use program, they can track when they're using energy and reduce their rates further and win further prizes through our program just by doing that. So you've heard enough from me. We've got two speakers today, Seth, first we're going to have Kyle up and then Seth going right after him. I'll let them introduce themselves. And so now I will hand it first over to Kyle at WattTime. Kyle, welcome. Thank you. And please take it away.
Hey, Brett. Thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Coming in good? Yep.
Perfect. Hey, everyone. I'm Kyle with the very intricate spelling. My mom really made my life a whole lot easier. Nobody ever pronounces it right, but hey, it's Kyle. I am a senior partnerships manager here at WattTime. My core focus is really working with a variety of different partners that we have to help them implement solutions that help them reduce carbon emissions. Really, WattTime in a nutshell is we effectively can help any country, government, corporation, individual understand the real world environmental impact of any energy decision. And then we create solutions that these organizations can use to reduce emissions in the most scientifically valid, cost-effective, and evidence-based manner. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about WattTime, kind of what we do, and then this idea of marginal emissions as a whole and kind of in the market today, and how this can be applicable to a lot of the work that many of you are doing. Seth?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Seth Mullendor. I'm president and executive director of Clean Energy Group. We are a national nonprofit organization that works across the country to advance a equitable transition to a sustainable and resilient clean energy future. So I'll be talking after Kyle about our Phase Out Peakers initiative, talking about the environmental justice implications of peak power. So Kyle, go for it.
So today in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about our background, kind of who WattTime is, this idea of marginal emissions data. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with average emissions data or annual average emissions factors. Maybe when you've had to do carbon accounting for scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 against the greenhouse gas protocol. So we'll talk a little bit about the differences there. What are some solutions, kind of products, or as we call them at WattTime, choices that we enable with this marginal emissions data? And then a couple examples and case studies that highlight some different companies that are actually enabling this today. And you could, after this session, go to a store or go online and get some technology that has some capabilities in it. And then we'll punt the Q&A till after Seth speaks, but please feel free to share questions in the chat. Stop me at any point, Seth, again, as we discussed, and I'm happy to dive deeper or offer clarifications. So who is WattTime? We are a bit of an unusual organization in that we have a tech startup DNA, kind of founded it at UC Berkeley, Silicon Valley area DNA, but we're actually a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And really what we set out to do at WattTime is answer two fundamental questions that back in, I think, 2014, when we were doing this PhD research, and so you all know I've been here about 7.5 years now, so really since our inception. But these two fundamental questions are so: whenever I flip a light switch or I plug in my electric vehicle or run my air conditioning, at those exact moments when I'm using energy, where is that electricity? Where is that energy coming from? Or said differently, what kind of power plant is supplying that energy? And the more important choice for us from this behavioral economics lens was, do I have agency? Do I have choice to have the type of energy I want? Much like today, we don't go to a restaurant and order calories. We get say to have the type of food that we want. We're not just ordering calories and they give you salad, breadsticks, and a drink when you wanted, a pizza, right? We have choice, we have agency. So how does this apply to energy? How does this apply to emissions? And what does that actually mean for the world? So we've come up with a way at WattTime, and not just WattTime, there's several other organizations thinking about this. Whenever you change your energy use, whenever you flip a light switch, let's just use this example. At that exact moment in time, when I flip that light switch, which power plant, based on my location and based on the time that I use that energy, which power plant is actually responding at that exact moment? Which one am I causing to ramp up its production to meet that energy I just demanded? We call that the marginal unit. And if you take a look at this graph here, in this specific scenario, if you were to flip a light switch, charge your car, run your AC, at that exact moment in time, the type of power plant in this scenario that would respond to your change in load, your energy that you demanded, your light switch, would be a gas-fired marginal unit, and its marginal emissions rate would be 950 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour metric of electricity. But then if we take a look at this supply, this energy supply and this energy demand curve, right? And really what we're creating here is cost, right? That price, that wholesale price of electricity, if you think about supply and demand. And here, if you were to charge your car just 5-10 minutes later, the actual unit, the marginal unit that would respond changes. In this case, it's an oil-fired unit. And if you flip a light switch then, it will actually result in 1,450 more pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. It has a different marginal emissions rate. So the takeaway for us in this research initially was just on paper, right? We were saying, well, I guess what is responding to your when you change your load? Sometimes it could be a greener resource like renewable energy, or maybe it's a more efficient natural gas plant, right? Combined cycle, that is responding. But sometimes it can actually be a dirtier resource like a less efficient natural gas plant or oil or coal that is responding when your load changes. So at WattTime, what we really tried to do is base our models on evidence and be as empirical as possible, as opposed to theory or assumptions. For example, we're not simply figuring out what the actual price, the market price of electricity is, and from there ascribing an emissions value to that actual price. What we're doing is we're using historical information about the power grid that's publicly available. One key source would be the Environmental Protection Agency's continuous emissions monitoring system. And what we're doing is we're saying historically, when we saw how emissions changed, when energy demand changed, what were some of those grid conditions that were occurring? What was the weather? What was the price? What was the supply? What was the congestion, transmission? All these different grid phenomenon parameters that are occurring. We then pull that forward in real time and get data in real time from these things called balancing authorities. They're grid operators. So in California, that's California Independent System Operator, or CAISO. And we're saying, okay, if you flip a light switch now at 9:16 a.m., and I just happen to be in Scottsdale, Arizona, based on what we learned historically, and if these grid conditions, based on the data we get in real time, are met right now, these types of power plants would respond to when I flip my light switch at 9:16 a.m. in Scottsdale, Arizona. And these would be the emissions change on the system. So it's rooted in evidence. It's not rooted in theory, where you can make these assumptions that, yes, price and emissions are correlated, right? But they're not linked causally, which is what WattTime is all about, looking at evidence to predict what's going on in real time or in the future. So with this emissions data, what we did is after some of this PhD research, we actually met a couple ex-Googlers, MIT, really savvy tech folks at a couple clean tech hackathons that said, hey, this is really fascinating. This data you have, what if we put it in the cloud? We turned it into an application programming interface, an API. And now you had a system that could tell people in the world, or maybe devices, watt times, for a pretty terrible pun there that we use all the time, are clean and watt times are dirty. So taking a look at this graph here, this happens to be in Victoria, Australia. We see marginal emissions, pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour on the left, and then we see time of day. You can actually see that there's bands where that marginal emissions rate is dropping. And in this case, likely what is going on is there is a high probability that there is renewable energy that would have otherwise been curtailed or thrown away had we not sopped up that renewable energy, because they have nothing to do with it, right? They can't turn off the sun, they can't turn off wind. So in this specific scenario, there's a lot of solar, and it's a great time to use energy at that moment if you have that flexibility. Another example is, in the 6 to 9 band, we see that those emissions are much higher. That's because about 2,000 pounds of CO2, you're looking at a pretty dirty resource like coal in that scenario. So use energy at the clean times and try to avoid using electricity during the dirty times if you have that flexibility and if you can be indifferent effectively. So we talked a lot about marginal emissions data, what it is, kind of understanding, at least initially, how WattTime started, but what were some of these actual products and use cases that we can enable with this data? So the very first and foremost one that maybe some of you are familiar with is what we call automated emissions reduction, or AER software. This is really akin to other words like carbon aware, carbon intelligence. These are other words we've heard in the market. And really what we're doing here is with our API, we have real time, every 5 minutes, marginal emissions data. We have a rolling, so every 5 minutes, a new 72-hour forecast of marginal emissions rates in 5-minute increments. So every 5 minutes, new 3-day values of marginal emissions rates with a 5-minute granularity. And then we have historical marginal emissions rates. What we're doing is we're working with organizations like Google Nest and their thermostats, grid scale batteries, behind the meter batteries, so residential battery companies, to allow these devices to take in our WattTime marginal emissions data or another signal that has marginal emissions data, and then effectively integrate this into the actual control logic, the actual operations of these devices, to allow these devices to actually shift energy use to moments when our marginal emissions data says, hey, this is a really good time, this is a clean time, let's not do it at this time, this is the dirty time. But the whole vision and what is really in our DNA here is this idea of have your cake and eat it too. So I don't think virtually anyone that we're working with today is saying, hey, this should be a luxury, you should be paying a lot of money, or you should lose out on, maybe you're in a time of use rate and you're already saving money within a specific band. Well, within that band, say it's 3-4 hours, we can still shift energy use, never going to the higher priced band of time of use, like the peak time that Brett was talking about. We can go outside of that and shift energy in 5-minute increments, making sure that whatever your device was doing before is happening, making sure your thermostat set point is reached, making sure your car is charged in the morning, making sure your battery is still saving your building money on demand charges, but now also continuously optimizing for carbon emissions. Another use case that we really stumbled upon when we started getting interest from a lot of universities and really larger tech companies thinking about procuring renewable energy was this idea that not all renewable energy is created equal. And what I mean by that is you can apply this same, in most cases, it's our historical emissions data. You can apply this same idea of marginal emissions data that we apply to devices in shifting them in time. You can apply that into location. So what this means is that different areas throughout the world, some of those areas have more renewable energy penetrations, right? Which that means is there's more times if we think about like the first couple of slides I was doing, there's more times where there's, dirty and clean times. So there's a lot more variability in the marginal emissions data, a lot more noise. So those grids are great candidates for building renewable energy, because maybe today most companies are just thinking about, okay, maybe I want to do it local where I have my buildings, but a growing number of companies like 15, 20, 25 are actually starting to buy renewable energy in grids that will result in a greater emissions reduction. This word avoided emissions, you may have heard it come up in some carbon accounting, maybe if there's on-site solar that you have or larger solar projects that you guys have been involved in. This idea is to maximize the avoided emissions of your renewable energy decision, all else equal. So you've already done your hedge, you've already done your risk, you already locked in your price, you already know the power guarantee per year of the long term of that. A great example, a great vehicle is, because it's additional, is a PPA, power purchase agreement. And now you can actually make those renewable energy projects go further in emissions reductions by maximizing avoided emissions per dollar. This is something that organizations like Salesforce, Boston University, Nucor, and several others are doing. Rivian are doing on a regular basis to maximize those avoided emissions reductions and make their dollars go a lot further in reducing emissions. And this one I think is probably maybe the most applicable, just given what I saw in the chat. We have a lot of architects, designers, engineers in buildings. What we've done here is we're working, and I'd say this is probably our least mature product in terms of, we have a lot of organizations using it. It drives a lot of emissions reductions, but the other two can drive more emissions reductions, at least today, just given who's using it. But working with a lot of architects and designers who have already done these building energy models. They know the cost, they know the rough, BTUs of the system, the chillers, the heating, right? The insulation, the weather. They already have integrated all of this into their energy model. And prior to the building being built, if maybe a building wants to be carbon neutral, carbon negative, right? So it would be helpful to understand, well, if we design the battery system like this, if we have the chiller efficiency like this, if the solar panels are this way, if our window is this thick, how does that affect energy efficiency? Well, now you can also get a sense of, prior to that building going into the ground and being built, what are the carbon implications? What's the carbon emissions reductions I can expect from these specific design strategies? So we've taken our historical emissions data and we've actually normalized it for meteorological years, typical meteorological years, which is something that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. And now what you can actually do is you can get a sense of, today, if I want to go design a building, I know which strategy will result in greater or lesser carbon emissions reductions. Couple examples and case studies, just kind of in the real world today, most of these. So the first one would be electric vehicle charging. This is a really good example because there's a lot of flexibility, this idea of load flexibility, right? Like a light is on or off. You don't want to be in the dark necessarily to save carbon. You're not going to time a heart monitor, right, to when the grid is greener. That makes no sense at all, right? Somebody could seriously get hurt to save some carbon. Those are not good use cases. But about 70% of smart devices today are flexible, maybe 65, but just about 70. And what this means is that they have some sort of energy cycle. Maybe it's a charging cycle. Maybe it's a compressor cycle in a refrigerator, like a thermostat. It's trying to reach a set point, but when it's using energy is random, unless you're doing maybe your Nest thermostat or other type of thermostat is intelligent. It can already take in your utility price and it can optimize accordingly and also be energy efficient. In this use case for EV charging, a great example is, if you look at the graph here, we see the marginal emissions intensity on the top. Then we see a scenario where you would have baseline charging, kind of this counterfactual, what you would have done without WattTime normally, and then you have actual charging. if you take the difference in the area, you actually get the emissions you avoided from charging unintelligently, or maybe only for price or charge, versus now also factoring in carbon emissions. And so the idea here is that when normally you just charge your car, let's say 10 p.m., you wake up 8 a.m., that thing's fully charged. Now we're not necessarily starting immediately. We're actually going to say, okay, we know the window of opportunity is 10 to 8. That's 10 hours, right, of time. We only need 3.5, 4 hours of charge for a level 2 charger. Let's spread that work throughout the available window of opportunity, making sure the car is charged in the morning, making sure we're not violating other constraints like cost or energy efficiency, and shifting continuously when marginal emissions are lower to maximize, to squeeze out as much emissions reductions as possible. So this is that AER example I was describing. In some cases, we got a question. Did I factor in off-peak in some way to emission costs?
You don't have to answer those now. We'll get to them later.
Okay.
So, Kyle, you don't have to worry
You
about
got
it.
it.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, you got it. I won't worry about that right now then. Let me get out of the way. So in this case, you're able to actually still have all the things you had before, but now the car is able to save on some days up to 90% carbon emissions, and on average, depending on the grid, we're seeing about 25% carbon emissions reductions. Another example here will be the AC, chillers, refrigerators, or heat pumps. These are really good because they have some sort of compressor. They have a cycle, right? So you can actually look here at the first graph is just the marginal emissions rate. The second will be the chiller compressor timing when it's using energy. And then you see that if you optimize this chiller compressor timing that was previously random or maybe only focused on cost, that actually will occur. You shift it to the times when the marginal emissions rate is actually lower. Still getting all the things you wanted to do, but now reducing emissions. And the same kind of principle applies to thermostats as well. As I said, Nest thermostats, Nest Renew is what they call it. You can have this capability today. It's ready to go in most markets and sort of testing out, et cetera. But you can actually reduce those emissions because what we'll do is we'll do some preheating and pre-cooling with the Nest thermostat, making sure your set point is achieved, but doing that preheating or pre-cooling, post-cooling, post-heating at some cleaner moments. And then the one of the last ones I wanted to highlight was behind the meter energy storage. So this could be residential, this could be small to medium kind of commercial buildings. So don't think of like front of the meter would be like a utility scale battery that's doing capacity and arbitrage there. These behind the meter storage is really more focused on, at least today, helping with demand charges, smoothing out your demand, making sure you never get to that peak, and saving quite a bit of money for consumers, residential homeowners, and commercial folks. So in this case, the California Public Utilities Commission put out a program called SGIP for behind the meter storage. It incentivizes behind the meter storage to be built, right? And the idea behind this program's inception was, hey, we have a emissions problem in California. We have a transmission problem too with renewable energy. Let's build these batteries and let's use these batteries to help homeowners smooth out their peak and also reduce emissions. What was actually going on is that these batteries were increasing carbon emissions, because if we look at the graph here, you can see that the previously the charging and discharging levels, well, I guess you can't see on this graph, but previously the charging and discharging levels were not aligned with clean and dirty emissions times. So they were increasing emissions. So the Self-Generation Incentive Program, the CPUC, organized a working group to come up with a methodology, a way that California's battery problem could be solved. And today, WattTime's data is being used as part of that program. It's been going on for a couple of years now, and all behind the meter storage companies in California need to be net emissions reducing. They can still seasonally do arbitrage for demand charges, but they have to charge when our data says it's lower and discharge when our data says it's higher. Again, still making sure that we're capturing I think the latest numbers were 99.99% of previous financial incentives and reductions from cost. And so I think this is the last slide I had, or last two slides. This demonstrates the emission saving potential of different devices today. This really takes into account the available load flexibility, or really the window of opportunity of these devices in the horizon like that it has to effectively continuously optimize for emissions. And we can see that in specific grids today, the ones like CAISO North, you're going to get some higher savings because there's more solar. In other grids like Texas, you also might see a little bit more savings because there's more wind. And then in New York, some solar. PJM, MISO, ISO, and E are pretty flat. As in those grids, the marginal unit is generally coal or natural gas or oil. It just depends on roughly the mix at that time. And the last example here would be, as I was describing the emissionality, the approach of buying renewable energy after you've done all your other financial and risk vetting, you've narrowed it down to 10, 15, 20 projects. Where do we actually build those projects to maximize emissions reductions? This would be Boston University example. You can actually see here on GHG reduction. They actually incorporated this data, this historical marginal emissions data, into their decision matrix and selected a project that resulted in almost 250% more carbon reductions. So as opposed to building that locally, like near Boston University, they did it, I believe it was North Dakota or South Dakota, I can't remember off the top of my head, but that has coal, a lot more coal and a lot more dirty marginal emissions. So it would displace a lot more fossil fuel units by being built in that grid as opposed to locally by BU. Thank you very much. That's everything I had right now. Looking forward to all your questions. And then let me pass it back over to Brett to introduce Seth and Seth. Thank you.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Kyle. We'll come back to you with some questions. And Seth, feel free to go ahead and take it away and introduce yourself. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Kyle. That was a great lead in to my presentation. As I said, I'm Seth Mullendor, the Clean Energy Group. Share my screen here. Hope you all can see that. So I'm going to talk about how these marginal emissions are not just a climate issue, a greenhouse gas issue, but also an environmental justice issue. And what I'm specifically going to focus on is peaker plants. Now, if you're not familiar with those, these are the power plants really of last resort on the grid. They're called upon when all of the other power plants cannot meet the demand for energy. So typically, you talk about peakers firing up in summer when it's hot outside and there's a big demand for electricity for cooling. Increasingly, we're seeing a shift where there's a lot of winter peaking as well as we're seeing more electrification of heating as well. So these peaker plants tend to be smaller and less efficient, usually powered by oil and gas. The reason that the Clean Energy Group started looking at this and started our phase out peakers work about 4 or 5 years ago is that batteries started to become cost competitive. Because when these things fire up, they usually only fire up for a few hours. That's something that lithium-ion batteries can do today. And they were becoming cost competitive because these are very expensive. But when we looked at them more and more, we found that not only are they expensive, they're also very dirty. These are some of the most inefficient power plants on our energy system. A lot of them are combustion turbines, which are less efficient than combined cycle gas plants. The other thing is that they tend to be located where the load is, which makes sense, which means they tend to be located where there are a lot of people near population centers. And when we looked further into this, they were predominantly impacting low-income communities and communities of color. So through this project, which the Phase Out Peakers project I should mention is a collaborative effort. So we support a lot of on-the-ground groups, community-based organizations, frontline groups, environmental justice organizations that are opposing peaker power plants that are impacting their communities. We provide a lot of the technical support for this. So this is all available on our website. that I'm sharing right now. What we developed is a peaker plant mapping tool. So you can click there and open that up. And I'm actually waiting for it to load up at the moment. This is based off of a data that is available from the EPA. They released a new tool a little over a year ago called the Power Plants and Neighboring Communities Mapping Tool. That's not only helped us identify where peakers were, which we had done in the past, but also helped bring in more of emissions information and demographic information so that we could have a more robust data set to show the environmental justice impact of these power plants. This is loading much more slowly than usual, probably because I'm on Zoom here at the same time. Normally it loads right up. But what we looked at was a couple of demographic data points that are in this. So one is the low income, the number of low income households that are within a 3-mile radius of a peaker power plant. In the EPA data set, a low income household is any household that is less than twice the federal poverty level. We also looked at the percentage of people of color within a 3-mile radius of these power plants. And what we found was that the impacts on these communities are quite significant. Just to give you a sense of the scale of peaker power plants, let's see when this fully loads, but there are over 1,100 peakers currently active in the United States. This is 2019 data, which is the most recent data that EPA has. And that represents over 300 gigawatts of power capacity, which is about 30% of the fossil fuel fleet in the United States.
Seth, I thought I'd share my screen to help you out here if that helps. So.
Okay.
Is that work? Do you see that?
No, I don't see that.
Oh, you don't see it on my screen?
No, let me just see if I can stop sharing and get this to load up again. Sorry for the technical difficulties here.
You can guide me if you want. I'm just looking straight at the map and it's moving pretty quick for me. So
okay, for some reason I'm not seeing your screen at the moment.
I think you've got a bit of a data, you're bogged down a little bit. But if you just want to kind of let me know where to click, if you assuming you're aware of how it works. So
yes, I am. So I assume that you are on the main map, and I'm going to try to open it up in the background here again. What you'll be seeing for the default there is the low income percentile. So this is looking at the percentage of low income households in around peakers versus the average percentage of low income households across the country. So the darker the orange color, the higher the percentage, the higher the percentile of low income households. And you'll see a lot of orange on this. So what we found was that in looking at the data, more than 2/3 of the peaker plants are located in lower income communities, which is quite significant. And actually, Brett, if you'll scroll down a little bit, you'll see we pulled out those numbers. If you see the table down below the map, that will show what the actual numbers look like. And the other thing to note in that table is that not only are there more peakers in lower income communities, but also the emissions rates are significantly higher in lower income communities. So that's looking at the column all the way on the right, the average nitrogen oxide emission rates, NOx emissions. You'll see that the rates of emissions are quite a bit higher there, even though these don't operate all the time throughout the year. When they do operate, they're quite dirty. And it should be noted that NOx emissions are significant contributors to negative health outcomes. So that NOx can be a precursor to the formation of ground level ozone and particulate matter, which I know you mentioned before, Brett. These are both significant contributors to respiratory and cardiovascular conditions and higher rates of morbidity and mortality in communities. So worth noting that not only there are more peakers, but the peakers tend to be dirtier. And Brad, if you go to the next tab for the people of color, is that up
Yeah,
now?
no, yeah.
Okay, great. So this is looking again at percentages of people of color versus the national average. You see, it's a very different color scheme here, where we've got a lot more blue and less orange. But you'll see that depends on where you are in the country. So along the south of the US and along the coast, there's a lot of communities of color that are highly impacted by peaker plants. You'll also notice the same thing around cities. If you look at cities in the Midwest, like Detroit or St. Louis, you'll see that there are pockets of orange around there. The really significant thing to note in this is if you go down to the table below the map, that when you look at the population impacted within a 3-mile radius, the number of people that are impacted when you go to higher percentages of people of color, in this case, the threshold, kind of the average is 31% or higher, you see that the numbers are quite a bit higher. This is showing that these peakers are located around population centers, around cities, and in neighborhoods where you have higher percentages of people of color. And again, really quite shockingly, when we dug into the information behind it, in those highest percentiles, where there are the highest percentages of people of color in surrounding communities, that's 65% people of color or higher, the NOx emission rate is significantly higher, verging on double the rate versus communities with lower percentage of people of color. And this is a significant health impact and clearly an environmental justice disparity that we're seeing here. So in the work that we do, we are helping to support not just opposition to these power plants to shut them down, but also alternatives to provide clean peak power. So Kyle talked a lot about demand management and demand shifting. That is a big tool in shifting demand away from these peak periods so that you don't have to utilize peaker power plants. Certainly the development of battery storage and renewables that can also produce power during these times. There are other big things that can reduce the reliance on these peakers. So this is an interactive map. I can't really show a lot of that, but you can zoom in, you can zoom out, and there are ways as well. There's an arrow down at the bottom of the screen that you can download the data as well. That'll pop up another box that will allow you to download the image or download the data behind the image. And if you download the data, you can hit download again, and that'll put it in an Excel spreadsheet. So this is all open source, the data. We're happy to work with people to pull out if you're interested in certain areas or how they're impacting communities where you're active or where you're doing projects. Always happy to help people figure out what does the peaker landscape look like in your communities, who's working on these issues, because we're connected to a lot of the groups on the ground as well. And if you have any questions or suggestions about how we can improve the tool, we're always looking for ways to make it more useful and improve the user experience for all of you. So I'll end my presentation there. Again, sorry for the technical difficulties, but thanks, Brett, for stepping in, and we can open this up to any questions folks have.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Seth, for bearing with us here. And hopefully it looks like it worked for everybody when I shared my screen. So if we need to reference it again, I can go back to it. So yeah, just real quick before we jump into questions, and I do see some questions coming in here. But before we get to those questions, a quick reminder. Yes, you can absolutely re-watch this session or share this session, catch up on something that you might have missed. Simply just go to our YouTube channel right now, click subscribe, and you'll get an instant update when it is available there. For those of you watching this in the future, not right now, go ahead and head over to our Thinkific channel or GBCI platform or whatever platform it might be on. Take your quiz, get an 80% passing rate, and you will receive your certificate of completion for your CUs. And again, those of you here with us live today, as long as you've been here for a majority of the session, about 90%, you are approved for your certification. So check, mark your spam or mark it safe at certs@gutenbergcerts.com. And before we get to those questions, a huge thanks to our board of directors, all of our volunteers, our executive director, Jose, Reina, and all of our top tier sponsors who allow us to do what we do, Mitsubishi, Ream, April Air, and all of our session sponsors who help support our work. So yeah, let's get into some of those questions. I know this first one popped up here for you, Kyle. Do you have data that factors in off-peak in some way? Utility companies have cost incentive programs to shift users to basically use electricity at night during off-peak demand times of the day. However, the time of the day is when there's less renewable electricity available since PV panels are not producing at that time. Supposedly, this is using electricity that otherwise may gone to waste because power plants cannot easily be shut down at night.
Yeah, so this is a really good question. I think it comes up a lot, right? We think about on peak, off peak. Off peak is in some cases associated with it initially, I should say, with, oh, that's off peak, it must be clean, right? And then on peak must be dirty. It's just how it works. But actually, that would be if you were to take an assumption-based approach to calculating marginal emissions. What we're actually doing is, so it's a great question, Mark. We're factoring in demand, supply, wholesale price. We're factoring in all these different things, curtailment into our marginal emissions algorithms or models. And what we're saying is even within this peak period, what is actually going on when you use energy? So we're absolutely capturing, it's not like we have off-peak data that's going in. We're scanning the grid constantly to understand, okay, based on this exact moment, based on the constraints on the grid, based on the supply, the energy, the price, the weather, if you take this action that changes your energy use, which types of power plants are responding, even if it's a peak time, if it's an off-peak time. So absolutely, we're calculating and factoring those things in to our model to give you the truth. On average, if you take an action, what are those emissions causing on the system?
Yeah, and Seth, just bringing you in, what is the concern that, in theory, the idea is supposed to be it's a lower carbon time during this off-peak time, but that maybe what ends up happening is that, these overbuilt power plants just continue to run longer. And maybe it's not the peaker plant, Seth, but what other communities might have, negative adverse effects, at night if that's all that's going on? If that's something you looked into? Yeah.
If you want, I can talk a little bit about that because we do look at that too. Would that be all right?
Go for it. Yeah. Yep.
Hey, so Seth, wonderful presentation. He talked a lot about co-location of power plants with hospitals, lakes, community centers, right? Schools, disadvantaged communities, right? Where depending on race, there's a disproportionate number of power plants built near these disadvantaged communities. There's power plants built near hospitals, right? And so this idea of environmental justice is something WattTime's been thinking about for about 2 years now, and we've actually already started to factor in power plant proximity to recreational centers, hospitals, schools, etc., disadvantaged communities, to not only say, if I take this action right now, how am I affecting carbon emissions in the real world? But now, if I use energy at this time, at this location, what are the co-damages that I'm causing for health, the health damages, based on where that actual power plant is located relative to a hospital, a community center? So now we have a different parameter that companies can optimize for, soon can optimize for, organizations can optimize for, individuals can optimize for, which is health. How many lives am I affecting when I flip this light switch? How many, what's the particulate matter associated that is causing health damages? And now we have this new, we haven't really coined it perfectly, but environmental justice marginal emissions rates is kind of the, so I know, so such good marketing, but that's not our best thing. We're just really good at telling you the truth about what's going on the grid.
Yeah, I think that's really important to consider that. I mean, we look at you have utility companies who of course give you incentives for energy efficiency. Sure. They give you incentives for now time of use. But what we've been struggling to understand is why we don't get incentives from our healthcare system to do whatever, make homes healthier, or now in this case, like you're saying, help people also continue to shift their loads during reduced marginal emissions. So, I don't know if you've seen anything like that where healthcare systems have come on board and said, hey, we're also going to support this.
I haven't seen it. I mean, maybe from, the corporate social responsibility from like these healthcare companies are thinking a little bit about this type of stuff. But and maybe some regulatory incentives, particularly around co-location of power plants with disadvantaged communities, with hospitals, these types of things. Those are really probably coming more from the environmental groups themselves, right? Sierra Club, these types of groups, Greenpeace. But what we're also seeing is really just a lot of sort of funding and regulatory pressure to actually tweak time of use rates to not only help people lower cost, but now incentivize from a lower utility cost perspective, energy cost perspective. Can we also have that time of use rate be aligned with the lowest emissions time? So we're involved in several discussions with policymakers, more the utilities themselves and the public utilities commissions, right? And some of the offices around the nation and globally, to how can we incentivize, maybe it's for a demand response program, right? Offering more money, less money, but also offering a carbon savings or offering more favorable time of use rates that factor in emissions. So that's kind of what we're seeing today.
Hey, great, thanks. Yeah, and Seth, welcome back. I was just saying one of the questions for you, if you wanted to elaborate, was just this concern, beyond peaker plants, but that utilities, through their time of use program were, had a second goal of just using their fossil fuel plants throughout the night that are being underutilized, and how those might have impacts on low income and communities of color. So Kyle did a good job answering. I don't know if you want to add any more to it though. So.
Well, I didn't hear Kyle's answer, unfortunately.
Right.
Sorry, you'll see my background change because I've had all sorts of technical difficulties here. But I will say, one thing that is often kind of this, there's a lot of talk about excess renewables, which is it's not a true narrative. Fossil fuel plants often have contracts to produce a certain amount of power over time. So it's not a technical issue necessarily that they can't be turned down. Though a lot of things like coal plants, it takes a lot of work to turn them down. Nuclear plants, that's even more work to turn them down. But often there's contracts in place where they say, okay, this facility can't be turned down more than this. So it's not that renewables are producing too much energy. It's that it would be uneconomic to turn these power plants down. And that's where we get some of these narratives around excess renewables. And we get more dirty energy at times when, we don't really need it. There often are incentives to run incentive things throughout the night. That's kind of how our power system got started, was we wanted to be running these things all the time to make them economic. Renewables, of course, are a lot different. And when you can shift demand around and you've got batteries and you've got flexible demand, this flips the whole thing on its head. And that's where we need to head to get to the renewable future.
So one thing I asked Kyle, maybe you can follow up, is that, we see incentives from the utility companies for energy efficiency rebates now, of course, time of use. But what we are wanting to see are incentives from our healthcare communities to be proactive, not only on healthy home things that we talked about in other sessions, but now on something like this, where if they could, Kyle was mentioning, now we can kind of know actual health impacts potentially of these peaker plants. Are any of the healthcare agencies coming in and saying, hey, we also want to help you shift your load so we don't have 20 more people showing up in the ER? I mean, is it getting that granular ever? And that's to you, Seth. So.
Yes. So, increasingly there's been more and more focus on realizing that the climate crisis and the health crisis are tied together. So, we're not just talking about carbon emissions. We're talking about the health impacts, the local impacts, and a lot of things when people are talking about, net zero emissions, that doesn't mean zero emissions. So there's still a lot of localized impacts. And there are a number of technologies being talked about more these days, such as hydrogen, that if you're going to be burning them, you're still going to have things like NOx, even worse, potentially than burning gas. So they are not environmental justice alternative. So when you're talking about direct engagement with healthcare, there is this realization that this is a problem. This is contributing to the morbidity of people. A lot of our work also is working on what we call resilient power. This is backup power with alternatives to traditional generators, so batteries and on-site solar. And the fact that most are increasingly a number of people that depend on electricity to power home medical devices, or heating and cooling, which is just something that we need for people to be able to maintain their health during times of extreme heat and cold. And the fact that access to energy is directly tied to people's ability to have a good, healthy life.
Seth, I'm really glad you brought up resiliency, and I forgot to tell everybody that this is your second time on the show. You were here in 2016, so welcome back. I forgot to say that, talking about resilient power, and we've certainly come a long way since then. So I'm glad you brought it up, and I wanted to bring up resiliency in the larger context to Kyle here real quick. And right now, this is real for me. Right now I'm being told, well, not yet, but in an hour, I'm being told to stop demanding energy from the grid, or I'm going to get slammed with 5 to 6 times the electric rate, because we are in a situation in Michigan where we have a heat wave coming, though thankfully I think a cold front came and it ended up dying down. But nonetheless, the utility warned me, hey, Brett, stop using energy from 2 to 6, or we're going to charge you 5 to 6 times the rate. And fire up all of our peaker plants, making you feel guilty, right? I mean, that's, I'm not guilty, but I don't want to be a part of this. So I'm going to answer the call. But, when we get a real situation like how close we've been coming in Texas and all that, Kyle, what does, programs like this play a role in ensuring that the grid doesn't go down to communicate and get people to reduce, not just to save energy and be carbon free and save money, but to literally stop brownouts and blackouts from occurring, through programs like this? Is that anything you're working on?
Yeah, so I would say we're not directly focused on resiliency programs, but it just so happens that from the behavioral economics perspective, in many of the companies we work with, like C-Power, right, Voltus, Sapient, these companies are thinking about demand response, right? And this is more relevant from a commercial scale, but buildings do this all the time. But what we're actually thinking about with these organizations is framing, right? And many utility programs, like there's one in ComEd, where the goal in Texas, right, is, hey, we don't want a brownout or blackout. It's extremely expensive. The grid could be, messed up for days. We won't be able to get you power. People are thinking about backup power and what they can do is, but if you start framing it in a different way, like basically a consumer is more likely, in our research, and we've done these studies, is more likely to hand over more of their load, more of their energy use based on when they're getting choice, agency, greener energy. So I know you said don't focus too much on the carbon value of these programs, but it's actually more about just saying, hey, you're no longer going to be throwing away renewable energy. Yeah, we'll save you some money and we'll pay you the $10 you probably don't really care about by shifting energy use 20 times in a year, or curtailing or not using energy. But in our studies, their willingness to accept a program, a DR program, a resiliency program, whatever you want to call it, if it's framed around, I will give you the energy you want, or I will give you more renewable energy, or I will help you save lives, or I will help you prevent this fishery from being polluted, you get a lot more adoption and uptake in willingness to accept and willingness to actually go in and connect the thermostat and participate by framing things around, and not only framing, actually delivering and telling people what those savings were, emissions, lives, et cetera. And Seth, you missed the point that I was talking about earlier, which is we're also factoring in EJ, we call them EJ marginal emissions rates. We're factoring now marginal health damages and co-location, of power plants, which I think we should talk about offline too, to hospitals and schools and disadvantaged communities, to now not only say what are the emissions, but based on the health impacts of this power, particulate matter, how many lives am I harming? So you can optimize for lives, carbon, both, etc., which is really, really interesting.
That's
Any
fantastic.
thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say, Brad, I think like the importance of what we're talking about here, the fact that you're facing a heat wave in Michigan. I'm in Vermont. We've had way too many 90-degree days this year.
Yep.
This is the problem, and we need to change what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you guys still have a couple of minutes for a question or two here?
Please.
Cool. Mark, member here, he's saying it seems that really having solutions to manage a person's electricity draw from the grid to be as uniform and low as possible, so to some extent energy efficiency there, I imagine, is the critical way to get and allow fossil fuel and nuclear plants to reduce their production. And we don't have time to go into the nuclear conversation here, but I appreciate you bringing it up, Mark. So he's saying is uniform demand being the major factor that in this, correct?
Say the question again. I'm sorry.
So is uniform demand in that is, I think, and Mark, if you want to elaborate on what uniform demand is, but I'm assuming, a consistent demand, a consistent low efficient demand being a major factor in these strategies.
I'm happy to start things off. I think that it used to be that the most efficient, economically efficient way to run the grid had always been, let's have pretty uniform demand so our power plants can operate as much as possible. We can build as few, peaker plants are this excess thing that you got to build that costs more and you only use them a few hours a year. So they're not very cost effective. It's not the cleanest way to run the grid. Now the cleanest way to run the grid is to shift and align your demand with the cleanest source of energy, renewable energy, which we don't have a lot of control over unless we put batteries into the system to help us control that more. But shifting the use to those times when we have renewable energy, the cleanest energy possible, that's really the key now. It's not about like uniform demand. If we're talking about consistent level of demand, that's my reading of this. It's of matching and aligning it with those clean sources of generation.
Yeah, I would agree, Seth. That's my understanding of Mark, and tell us if please speak in the chat if your meaning of uniform demand is different. But what we're focused on is, yes, let's shift energy to times when we are nearly sure, as sure as we can be, that renewable energy would otherwise have been curtailed or thrown away. So aka renewable energy on the margin is the marginal unit, or it's going to be thrown away if you don't soak up that demand. But what we're also doing is there's different types of technology that make coal. There's different types of technology that make natural gas that could be 20 to 30% more energy efficient, which means that even within a peak time, or even during times when there isn't solar being curtailed, let's say in California, in full transparency, most of the time, the outside of the day, the marginal unit responding to changes in load in California is natural gas. But even that, it's just think about revving an engine, right? If you're able to use less energy to output fuel, then that means it's going to have less emissions, right? Coming out of the tailpipe in a car. The same thing works for a power plant. So even within those peaky times, you can actually still squeeze out 10 to 20% carbon emissions reductions relative to what you had done before, by optimizing for even when there's like a drop from 1,500 to 1,200 or 1,200 to 900 from that type of from that fossil fuel unit operating more efficiently.
Yeah, that's a good point. I appreciate you bringing up that perspective. So, well, we are at our time now, and I really appreciate both of you educating us and going over these important topics. And Seth, I'll just give it to you first real quick. Where can people go to learn more, find out more information, or get involved, maybe even on an advocacy side to help with some of these issues?
Yeah, best way is to go to our website, cleanegroup.org. Contact information for me and everyone else that works here is readily available there. We've got our Phase Out Peakers initiative there. We've got our Resilient Power initiative. And my email is up here, seth@cleanegroup.org. Please feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk to folks.
Great, thanks, Seth, and good to see you again out there. And then Kyle, just real quick, where can people go to reach out, learn more, and contact you?
Sure, yeah. So my email is here. I've already seen a couple of you request me on LinkedIn. Please feel free to do that. We can chat. Would love to talk. Again, we are a nonprofit, and we can't do this without everybody, every organization, every person in the world thinking about this stuff. And both topics really, where power plants are located, timing, location, all these different things. We would love to discuss how they can benefit the world. So yeah, please drop me a line. Reach out on our website too. We have a contact page, whatever you prefer. I'm happy to chat. Thank you very much.
Great, Kyle, Seth, thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your week. Stay cool out there. Take care. Bye.
Yeah, thanks guys. Bye.
Be sure to check out all of our courses available online that you can watch anytime and anywhere to pick up your CEUs. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube to get weekly updates and stay up to date on green building science courses, webinars, and home tours. Thanks again.